Thalidomide tragedy. The thalidomide tragedy was a pharmaceutical disaster caused by the widespread prescription of a drug that led to severe birth defects. Introduced in the late 1950s, thalidomide was marketed as a safe treatment for morning sickness, anxiety, and insomnia. It was sold over the counter in many countries and prescribed to pregnant women with minimal caution. At the time, drug regulation was limited, and testing for effects on fetal development was not required. Animal trials failed to reveal the risks to human embryos. The consequences emerged gradually. Thousands of children were born with missing or severely shortened limbs, damaged organs, and lifelong disabilities. Many died shortly after birth. Physicians initially treated cases as isolated incidents. The broader pattern went unrecognized, while manufacturers continued distribution, despite internal concerns. The failure was systemic rather than accidental. There was no effective mechanism to monitor adverse drug effects. Regulators relied on company data. Doctors trusted approvals. Patients trusted doctors. Each layer assumed responsibility lay elsewhere. What went wrong was the lack of accountability for uncertainty. No one required proof of safety for unborn children. When evidence became undeniable, responses were slow, uneven, and defensive. An estimated 10,000 children were affected worldwide. Survivors required lifelong care. Thalidomide reshaped drug regulation, introducing stricter testing and consent standards. These reforms came only after irreversible harm. The tragedy required no malice, only confidence, speed, and silence. Tuskegee Syphilis Study. The Tuskegee Syphilis Study was a government-sponsored medical experiment that deliberately denied treatment to infected patients. Beginning in 1932, U.S. public health officials enrolled hundreds of black men in Alabama into a long-term study of untreated syphilis. Participants were told they were receiving care for a condition called bad blood. They were never informed of their diagnosis or the true purpose of the study. Meaningful consent was not obtained. Over the next 40 years, researchers documented the progression of the disease, including complications and deaths. When penicillin became an effective cure in the 1940s, the study continued. Treatment was intentionally withheld. Doctors took steps to prevent participants from receiving antibiotics elsewhere. Observation replaced care. The study persisted because it was institutionally protected. It was federally funded, internally reviewed, and published in medical journals. The men were treated as research subjects rather than patients. What failed was medical ethics. Researchers understood the consequences of untreated syphilis and chose not to intervene. Racial assumptions and bureaucratic routine made that decision sustainable. By the time the study was exposed in 1972, dozens had died. Families had been infected, and trust in public health institutions had been deeply damaged. Radium Girls Incident. The Radium Girls Incident was an industrial medical failure involving the radioactive poisoning of factory workers. In the early 20th century, young women were hired to paint watch dials with radium-based luminous paint. The job was presented as safe. Workers were instructed to shape their brushes with their lips, ingesting radium repeatedly. Meanwhile, company scientists handled the same material using protective equipment. The harm appeared slowly. Over time, workers developed jaw necrosis, anemia, bone fractures, and cancers. Teeth fell out. Bones weakened and collapsed. Diagnosis was delayed because radium was still widely believed to have health benefits. Exposure continued due to denial and profit. Companies dismissed complaints, blamed unrelated illnesses, and sponsored research to obscure the cause. Some doctors repeated these conclusions without verification. Workers were reassured as their conditions deteriorated. What failed was the control of knowledge. Management understood the risks well enough to protect themselves. That knowledge was withheld from workers. Many died. Lawsuits lasted years and reshaped labor safety and occupational health standards. Willowbrook Hepatitis Study. The Willowbrook Hepatitis Study was a medical experiment that deliberately infected children with hepatitis. From the mid-1950s to the early 1970s, researchers at the Willowbrook State School in New York studied hepatitis by intentionally exposing institutionalized children to the virus. The school housed children with intellectual disabilities, many from families with limited options. Admission was often tied to parental consent for participation in the study. Children were fed contaminated food or injected with material containing live hepatitis virus. Researchers tracked symptoms and immune response over time. The study was justified by claims that hepatitis was already common within the institution, reframing infection as controlled exposure rather than harm. The experiment persisted due to institutional convenience. Researchers needed a stable population for long-term observation, and ethical oversight was minimal. Consent was obtained under pressure, with limited disclosure and no realistic alternative. The harm was tolerated because it appeared gradual. Long-term liver damage was poorly understood, and the children's vulnerability was normalized. The study later influenced hepatitis research and vaccine development, while exposing serious failures in consent standards. For the children involved, the consequences were permanent. Libby asbestos exposure. The Libby asbestos exposure was a public health failure that allowed toxic contamination to persist for decades. In Libby, Montana, vermiculite mining released asbestos fibers into the air, soil, and buildings throughout the town. The material was processed locally and distributed nationwide, while dust settled over homes, schools, and playgrounds. Workers and residents inhaled the fibers daily, often without any protective equipment. The harm emerged slowly. Years later, cases of lung disease, asbestosis, and rare cancers began to appear. People with no direct connection to the mine fell ill. Children developed respiratory problems. Local physicians noticed unusual patterns but lacked authority and resources to intervene. Exposure continued because responsibility was fragmented. The mining company controlled health data. Regulators relied on industry reporting, and early warnings were minimized. Economic dependence on the mine discouraged scrutiny. By the time federal agencies intervened, contamination was widespread. Hundreds died, thousands were affected, and Libby became a Superfund site. Medical care addressed the damage long after prevention was possible. Bristol heart scandal. The Bristol heart scandal was a pediatric surgical failure marked by persistently high mortality rates. From the 1980s to the mid-1990s, children undergoing heart surgery at Bristol Royal Infirmary in the UK died at rates far above the national average. Surgeons continued operating despite clear evidence of poor outcomes. Concerns raised by medical staff were dismissed or downplayed. The problem was visible. Mortality data existed, and patterns were clear, yet surgeries continued without effective intervention. Parents were not fully informed of the risks compared to other hospitals, and referrals were rarely redirected elsewhere. The failure persisted due to professional insulation. Senior surgeons held authority. Peer review was weak, and whistleblowers lacked protection. Institutional reputation took priority over accountability. Dozens of children died who might have survived with proper oversight. A public inquiry later led to reforms in clinical governance, outcome reporting, and patient transparency. These changes came only after prolonged and avoidable loss of life. Michigan radiation experiments. The Michigan radiation experiments were medical studies that exposed patients to radioactive substances without informed consent. From the 1960s to the early 1970s, researchers at the University of Michigan administered radioactive iron and calcium to patients to study nutrient absorption. Many subjects were poor, elderly, or mentally ill. They were told they were receiving routine treatment or supplements and were not informed the substances were radioactive. The experiments were thoroughly documented in research records but not disclosed to participants. Patients ingested or were injected with radioactive materials described as low risk despite uncertain long-term effects. Follow-up prioritized data collection over patient health, and consent forms, when present, omitted critical details. The studies continued due to institutional normalization. During the Cold War, radiation research expanded rapidly, and ethical oversight was weak or deferential. Vulnerable patients were chosen because they were accessible and unlikely to object. The consequences emerged slowly. Some participants later developed cancers or radiation-related illnesses, though causation was disputed. Public disclosure decades later led to apologies and compensation programs, while trust in academic medicine remained damaged. Baycol drug withdrawal. The Baycol drug withdrawal was a pharmaceutical failure involving a cholesterol medication linked to fatal muscle breakdown. Baycol was approved in the late 1990s as a statin designed to lower cholesterol. Shortly after its release, reports emerged of rhabdomyolysis, a rare but severe condition involving muscle breakdown that can lead to kidney failure and death. The risk increased significantly when Baycol was taken with certain other medications. What happened followed a pattern of accumulation. Adverse event reports increased. Internal analyses suggested Baycol carried a higher risk than competing statins. The drug remained on the market while warnings were adjusted incrementally. Physicians continued prescribing it, often unaware of the comparative danger. The reason for delay was procedural caution shaped by commercial pressure. Regulators required clear statistical thresholds. The manufacturer disputed interpretations of the data. Each side waited for stronger evidence while patients continued exposure. What went wrong was reliance on passive reporting systems. Fatal outcomes were treated as rare exceptions rather than signals. Risk communication lagged behind prescription volume. The consequences were concrete. At least 31 deaths were officially linked to Baycol before it was withdrawn in 2001, with estimates suggesting more. Lawsuits followed. The case highlighted weaknesses in post-market drug surveillance. For those affected, regulatory improvement arrived after exposure had already occurred.